Greg McPherson, President of City Club. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel along with all of you listening on OPB or viewing on Portland Community Media or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Chevron Corporation, Echo Northwest, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Vacasa Vacation Rentals. Please show our appreciation for all of them. Today's Friday Forum is titled The Port at 125, a candid conversation about economics, equity, the environment, and labor. The Port of Portland marks its 125th year in 2016, a quarter century older than City Club. We will hear from Bill Wyatt, Executive Director of the Port for the past 15 of those years. Bill Wyatt is a native of Astoria, Oregon. Before coming to the Port, he served as President of the Oregon Business Council, Executive Director of the Association for Portland Progress, and Chief of Staff to former Oregon Governor John Kitzhaber. Bill Wyatt served as a state representative from the Astoria area in the 1970s. Among his many civic activities was service on the Board of Governors of City Club on 2 different occasions. Today's presentation will be moderated by Catherine Ciarlo, a senior project manager at CH2M Hill in Portland, Oregon, where she leads the variety of transportation planning projects. Prior to joining CH2M, she served as the Transportation Policy Director in the Portland Mayor's Office and as Executive Director of the Bicycle Transportation Alliance. Please welcome Bill Wyatt and Catherine Ciarlo to City Club.
Greg, thank you very much. Great to see all of you here today. So I think the program is I'll have a couple of opening remarks, or maybe more than a couple, and then sit down and Catherine will put me to the grill along with you. You know, a little over 150 years ago, or I should start by saying we're all here. You, me, the people listening, we're here because a little over 150 years ago, white people, largely, came across the plains, over the rivers, across the mountains, down the Columbia, some down the Willamette, and arrived here to discover what Lewis and Clark had already identified as the ideal location for the center of what would become a booming metropolis and a center of trade. And the assets that they identified 150 years ago, we might not today identify as assets for that trade-related economy, but so it is, and we're all here. And that would be the free-flowing waters, then the free-flowing waters of both the Willamette and the Columbia, as a place to gather cargo, to assemble it, to trade it, to sell it. And lo and behold, in pursuit of that great mission, in 1891, the Port of Portland was created in those days to construct a navigation channel from what was essentially downtown Portland, what we now know as McCall Waterfront Park, to the confluence of the Willamette and Columbia River, and then ultimately to the mouth of the Columbia River and to, of course, points beyond. That was really where the Port of Portland began its life. And the evolution and that subsequent 125 years, this being our anniversary, is a really unique one, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to talk a bit about that, because of course we do so many different things. We still own a pipeline dredge, which is still active in the Columbia River, primarily helping to maintain that navigation channel. But of course, we now own 4 marine terminals. We're the largest owner of industrial land in the state of Oregon, and of course, we own PDX the Hillsborough Airport and the Troutdale Airport as well. So, you know, after our city was created, all of the collective infrastructure that developed over time to what we now know, you know, 2 interstate freeways, 2 transcontinental railroads, all having been merged from a wider number of railroads serving the area, came here in pursuit of that basic trade-related mission. And that has defined much of our community over the course of its life. We are more trade dependent than most places in the United States, largely because of all that has transpired over the course of the last 150 plus years. And the port, I think, really reflects that. And so if you think about obviously, the navigation-related mission of the port is an obvious one, but industrial land, how did we get into that business? We got into that business by using that pipeline dredge way back in the day to take material out of the river and put it on the land, which back in the 70s, the port began to develop and sell. Certainly Swan Island, you know, we say Swan Island, it used to be an island, is kind of the original industrial heart of the city. Rivergate is the largest industrial district park in the state, and largely as a result of those navigation-related missions, the filling, the dredging, et cetera, things that we're obviously not able to do today for appropriate and obvious reasons. Nevertheless, these industrial properties have contributed enormously to the economic well-being and health of our region. And so as we began to run out of land in Rivergate and Swan Island, we decided to use the expertise that we had and we have. We acquired the Troutdale Reynolds Industrial Park, what was then the old Reynolds aluminum plant, developed that, put it into use. It's the largest brownfield redevelopment in the state and in the history of the state. At the urging of the city of Gresham, we bought a large piece of property out in Gresham and are now converting that to industrial use as well. And our strategy on acquiring additional industrial land is pretty simple. If nobody else wants it, we'll take it and do what we can. And so this mission continues. And so we have basically 3 legs on our stool. One is aviation, one is maritime, and one is industrial land. They are very different, I can tell you, but each in their own way also very, very successful. PDX is enjoying just an incredible year. We expect to exceed 18 million passengers this year. My guess is that we'll spend over the course of the next few years well north of $1 billion in expanding the facilities, adding gates, adding capacity to account for a very active and I think optimistic future about commercial aviation. Every day, about 10,000 people get up and go to work at the airport. There are more people working at the airport than live in the city of my birth, Astoria, which is remarkable for me to think about. And it's a generator of not only jobs, but tremendous economic activity and a source of obvious pride. I'm very happy that you won our little swatch of PDX carpet. I'm sure the DEQ is going to want to run you through the test here before you exit the building with it. But all the discussion about our carpet has been a great problem for us to have. Structurally, the port is pretty straightforward. We're a regional organization with a statewide mission. We're a creature of state law, a municipal subdivision of the state of Oregon. We have a 9-member commission. 3 of them are with us today, and they're appointed by the governor. They serve for terms of 4 years. We do have very much a statewide mission, I would say a region-wide mission. About a third of the employees at PDX and about a third of our passengers come from Vancouver. And so it is a substantial and growing enterprise. On the marine front, the port has always been a gateway. Relatively little of the cargo that comes in or goes out at any of our marine terminals is actually coming from or destined for Portland. So for example, in the grain business, soybeans, we don't grow soybeans here in the state of Oregon. They come from some far distant location, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas. Wheat certainly coming from eastern Oregon. Automobiles, we're actually exporting automobiles now. Fords made in the central part of the United States coming out by rail and heading off to Asia. But if you're driving a Hyundai or a Honda or a Toyota here in Portland, there's a very good chance that it came in through the port's marine facilities and the balance of those vehicles going off to the Midwest. Potash, which is a fertilizing agent coming from Saskatoon. Soda ash used primarily in the manufacture of glass coming in unit cars from Wyoming. It's a gateway function, and I think that's something that is largely misunderstood. Even when the container terminal was up and operating, most of the cargoes, particularly the exports, were exports from other parts of Oregon or other parts of the region, not primarily Oregon, and agricultural in their orientation. And that has always been really central to the port. We are a gateway. The terminals and the properties that we own and manage also serve as venues and employment centers, substantial employment centers, and in most cases, not all cases, generating really good family wage jobs, which is something that I think Portland needs more of, not less of. So the last year has been pretty extraordinary on all fronts. We've seen a tremendous interest in industrial property, which reflects our economy. We've seen a significant increase in passenger volumes at the airport, which is reflected in everything from rental cars and parking to concessions and everything else related to the operation of the airport. A lot of new service, which is very, very significant. And on the marine front, it's been relatively slow. Part of that is obviously related to the ongoing challenges that we've seen at Terminal 6. But then there are other forces at play as well. Exchange rates, the dollar being very, very strong doesn't really help things like grain exports. And the auto business is really only beginning to recover after the last recession. So this current year is quite a bit better than last year, and I'm fairly bullish about the year ahead. So I'm very anxious to begin the question and answer session here, and just to say at 125, the port is growing, it's stable. 96% of our revenues come from business transactions, only about 4% from other public sources. And so we have to operate like a business. We do, but we do so with a public mission. And I think that's one thing which our employees are really attracted by, that sense of mission on the one hand, but on the other hand, having to go out there and earn it every single day, which I think we do. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Bill. For our listeners on the radio, we are talking with Bill Wyatt, Executive Director of the Port of Portland. He's here at the City Club Friday Forum luncheon with us. So when we were talking about what we hope to get out of this conversation with you, one of the things that kept coming up was this idea that people connect with the port very visibly with the airport, but that there's a lot more going on, and there's a lot of ways that the port really does impact people's daily lives all around the city. And so we'd like to just ask a few questions along those lines. And maybe we'll start with the airport, since that's familiar to people. You talked, and we obviously see when we're at the airport, something that looks different from many airports around the country. More focus on local businesses, more focus on smaller businesses. I would love to hear you talk about that a little bit, what that's meant and what that means going forward.
Well, I have to say, one of the reasons why I think PDX has been continually ranked by travelers as the best airport in the country, 7, I think, out of the last 11 years, 3 for 3, and I'm not here to announce anything, but I bet on 4 coming up here pretty soon on the season for things like airport rankings, is a strategy that was developed in the 80s around retail. And the strategy at the time, generally speaking, airports at the time would hire a single concessionaire, somebody who knew, the airport business, and that's the way most airports, commercial airports in the United States operate today. And the port decided that it would change that business model and manage the concession program itself. And so they did their own leases. They focused on, for the most part, local brands, although there are obviously national brands as well. And maybe most importantly to travelers, decided that they would also insist on what we call street pricing. And street pricing means if you go to Powell's Books at the airport and you buy my favorite book, Astoria, I recommend it, you're going to pay the same price at the airport as you do right down the street here at Powell's. And this may seem obvious to people at the now, but at the time, this was a really risky decision because concession revenues is an important part of running an airport. And over time, what's transpired is this. Concessionaires at the airport generate almost as much per square foot or per passenger as any airport in the country, and yet that local model with street pricing has proven to be enormously popular with the traveling public. And we're in the process of significantly expanding retail, more passengers, got to have more retail, and moving a much more significant percentage of the retail beyond security. Because with security as it is today, people want to get to the airport, get through security, and then oftentimes find themselves a little time on their hands. They want to have something to eat or they want to buy something, whatever. And so you're going to see new brands, new concepts. We're always refreshing that at the airport. Of course, a new carpet already in place, and we'll be expanding because we basically have 3,000 more airplane seats in the market today than we did a year ago on a daily basis. So just a lot more passenger volume going on as well. So it'll have a great feel to it, and I think it'll continue our string of being recognized as one of America's best airports.
So that's probably a good theme for this conversation is change at the airport and change in the city. And talking with you about how the port addresses change at the airport is good and helpful. And I'd like to have one more question about that, which is looking at the kinds of businesses that are there. And also, maybe you could talk about that, and you could talk about how the port works to make sure those reflect the changing face of the city of Portland. And then also, we hear in the news labor conversations about labor at the airport. And if you could address that as well, that would be great.
Sure. Well, I think, if you have an employment center in a community like this that attracts 10,000 people every day, it's an incredible concentration workforce. And I think one way to think about the airport is sort of like a mall, in effect, because that's what it feels like in many cases. But it's a mall in which we have a variety of stakeholders, some of whom we have dominion over and some of whom we don't. We have a rule book given to us by the FAA in some cases, by the TSA in other cases, so we don't get to set all of the rules for the daily operation of the airport. So it's a big, sometimes raucous family, and we have to find a way to get along with everybody. But the thing that I think has probably meant as much as anything else to the operation of the airport that most people here don't encounter and don't probably have a lot of interaction with is a decision that was made really just during the very initial days of my tenure at the port. In those days, the airport operated on a conditional use. And you can believe it or not, every 8 years, we'd go back into City Council and spend a year or 2, or in some cases 3, renegotiating the conditions of the conditional use, as though we were ever going to shut the airport if we didn't get the conditional use. And so kudos to then Mayor Katz and then later Mayor Adams in particular. We initiated a process to get rid of the conditional use permit and create essentially a permanent airport land use designation. And I'm sure that makes most people want to nod off, but as a condition of that, we agreed with a very large, broad-based group of stakeholders with whom this was negotiated about how we would operate in the future. So we have a very active citizen advisory committee that is talking to us all the time about issues like social equity at the airport, who we contract with, who we don't. And again, some of that we can control and some we can't. But it's a group of neighbors and other stakeholders. And one result of that over some period of time is that we have a position in the organization dedicated exclusively to this broad category of social equity. And our new manager is with us today, Steve Nakana, right over here. Raise your hand so everybody can see who you are, and if you want to visit with him later, feel free to do so. We have a very active DBE program at the airport, which affects certainly retail concessions and contracting. We do a lot of contracting at the airport.
For our radio audience, do you want to explain DBE?
Please. Yeah, disadvantaged business enterprise. So it goes by a number of different monikers and names, but minority or women-owned businesses. We have a very active and successful program. Last year, I think in contracting, for example, our target was 30% DBE, and we were above that. We're very successful. So very active. On the labor front, SEIU, in fact, Felisa, who was just up here a moment ago with Local 49, is part of what is essentially a national effort targeting airports as organizing opportunities. And I think it's useful to think about the different work groups at the airport. So there are our employees, port employees, and about a third of them are organized. All of our maintenance employees, for example, fire and police, and that's about a third of the organization. Our administrative employees are not organized, probably not a great target, but it's obviously available. Then the airlines, and the airlines are probably the single largest employer, pilots, flight attendants. Most of them, not all of them, most of them are organized. Then a third category or fourth category, I suppose, are airline service providers. These are the people who manage baggage, as an example, who clean the aircraft, who fuel the aircraft, and whose companies, whose employers contract with airlines to provide that service. There are a couple of airlines, Southwest, I think, and maybe United now, that do that themselves. And the airline service providers are an organizing target of SEIU. They're in the midst of that now. One additional category, I would say, concession workers. Unite Here has organized some of them are not, but that's an ongoing effort. And then for people who push the wheelchairs, they do many other things, but that's the service that most people identify them with. They work for a third-party company. They are not organized, and I believe that there is also an attempt to organize them as well. And most of this owes back to a decision many of the airlines made back in the middle part of the last decade to outsource things that were not directly affecting in-flight operations. And I'm sure there are a lot of carriers that would like to, and in fact, I think are revisiting the wisdom of that decision. I know that Alaska Airlines is actually very actively engaged in, I guess what I would call insourcing, re-employing the various people who they contracted out back in the earlier part of the last decade. So baggage handling, I'm not quite sure about aircraft cleaning, and so on and so forth. So it's a very active effort. It makes sense if you think about it because this concentration of employment is relatively small. You can identify people easily. The wage range is variable, so anywhere from minimum wage to well above minimum wage. And I think this will continue for some time. There are multiple unions involved, so there will be some elbows flying at some point along the way, but we're there to ensure that people play by the rules to the extent that we have rules that we can enforce.
It's good background. Thank you. I think that one of the things we're seeing probably in every government and governmental institution in the metro area is a very strong groundswell to involve more people who have not traditionally been involved in business, in governments, more people who've been maybe traditionally left behind by some of those institutions. And the port is obviously not alone in this. You've given us, I think, a good sort of lay of the land there in terms of labor at the airport. I know there's also conversations going on the waterfront as well, and maybe you could speak to that a little bit, but specifically, as you look at this changing landscape, what do you, as a quasi-public, but as you mentioned in your introductory remarks, also a quasi-private institution, what do you see doing? What do you see the path ahead looking like to manage some of these conflicts? So 2 questions there. What's happening on the waterfront, maybe very briefly, and then sort of what do you see your obligation being to wrestle with these things moving forward?
Yeah, these are really, I think, very, very important issues. And I think your earlier reference to things changing is important. And I'm gonna give you one example. Over the course, somewhere the last 5 years, 6 years, or 7 years, there has been an evolving notion that every job should pay something approaching a family wage. And I think, I'm just gonna say it, this may be controversial or not, that's a relatively new notion. And that is a challenge because not every business is structured to assimilate that cost, right? So we are not alone in dealing with that, but we are going to have to deal with it because the world of work is changing, and it's changing maybe more quickly than many of us are able to adapt, but it is definitely changing. And so, you know, we've created something at the airport called the PDX Workplace Initiative, which is designed in part to recognize that not everybody at the airport has a straight path forward. Not everybody has an opportunity to move up the ladder because the ladder was cut off, you know, particularly when the airlines outsource so much of this work. So we've created, for example, a digital job platform that's been very successful so far because one of the things that we're hearing from everyone at the airport is it's tough to find people right now. I mean, we're approaching, I don't know, what, 4.5% unemployment in our region, and that's getting pretty close to zero in terms of churn and challenge. And so we're doing what we can to help there. We've interviewed employees. What do you need to be more successful in the work you're doing? Transportation at the airport is a big challenge for people at a 24/7 operation when the transit system closes at 2 in the morning and doesn't open until 5:30. So how can we, you know, accommodate that? Healthcare, obviously the world of healthcare is changing immensely. What can we do to assist with that? So the Workplace Initiative, I think so far has been fairly successful at surfacing some of these challenges and helping with that. The waterfront is a very different environment. I would say, generally speaking, the waterfront pays owing to a long history of very active labor management relations. Very good wages. The ILWU represented here, I think, has been very effective over the course of its history at representing its workforce and providing not just a living wage, but really a family wage with the full line of benefits. One of the bigger challenges on the waterfront, frankly, is finding space and opportunity to develop more, because there is a demand for more waterfront related activity. It is a more contentious environment, I would say, generally speaking, from a labor perspective on the waterfront. I don't think that's going to change in the relatively near future, and it's highly organized. So there are different jurisdictions, different labor organizations involved. It's not always smooth, as we've encountered, I think, here in Portland. But I frankly am very proud of the fact, I like the fact, that waterfront jobs that we're associated with in one way or another, whether we're just providing the venue or helping with the development itself, really are middle-class jobs. And those are jobs which, generally speaking, in our region and in most metropolitan areas of the United States are going away. And I think we see that as part of our mission to try and create opportunities for more of that work. Because the kind of work that we're seeing really expand and grow here in Portland. You can go to any of the big office towers here and see people coding, and they're involved in the software business, and it's just this whole new economy. We're importing a lot of that labor. The people who grew up here, the indigenous workforce, are struggling in that economy, and we think it's a great opportunity because there are many jobs available potentially for us if we can create more opportunity, not just on the waterfront, but at places like the Troutdale Reynolds Industrial Park and elsewhere. There is a demand for work and for business that provides those kinds of jobs, and we see that as very central to our mission.
Just a reminder, we're at the City Club of Portland Friday Forum. We're here with Bill Wyatt, Executive Director of the Port of Portland. So, Bill, since you brought up the waterfront, or I guess I brought up the waterfront, but since we're talking about the waterfront, yesterday in the Willamette Week, there was an article about the Portland Harbor and the Superfund cleanup and the EPA's latest information out to us as the community on that. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the port's reaction to what the EPA has put out there, which is a combination of dredging and cleanup of the contaminated sediments and capping those sediments and making, just trying to keep them in place, which is less expensive. And there's different opinions in the community on which of those we should do. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the general approach, and then also some thoughts on how you see moving forward. How's the port going to pay for that, and what should we expect as a community?
Well, let me just first say this is a moment. It's been 15 years in the making, and I suppose the old adage, what goes around comes around, is appropriate here, because immediately prior to the listing of the Superfund site, I was John Kitzhaber's chief of staff, involved in negotiations with the EPA, the potentially responsible parties, of which the port, the city, Northwest Natural Gas, and others are involved. So I got to see that perspective. I got to listen to the then regional director of the EPA assure me, don't worry, we're going to wrap this up in 5 or 6 years, and the cleanup will be concluded. And I think at that time they were saying 06 or 07, which sure feels like a long time ago. So here we are 15 years later, and I think it's a milestone. It's a good milestone. The Port of Portland, I know I can speak for the city on this as well, the gas company, we want to see the river cleaned, and we want to see it cleaned in a way that doesn't bring us all back into this conversation in 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. For us, it's the right thing to do, so no doubt about that. We do have ambition on the waterfront that we're just unable to proceed with until this is resolved. So there is also, I think, a very important business decision. With respect to the specific conversation around monitored natural recovery and dredging and so on and so forth, I would say we're still this is a huge body of work, and so we're still assessing this. But you know, if monitored natural recovery doesn't really ring a bell with you, consider yourself human. But essentially, the notion there is over time, the river will effectively clean itself. And this isn't just a theory, this is a concept which has been applied for years and years and years. And the reality is, it's already happening in the Willamette River, right? As these studies have gone on, as all this interaction has occurred, the testing, which was the foundation, and we're talking thousands and thousands and thousands of samples that were taken in the lower reaches of the Willamette, conducted probably almost a decade ago, I would say. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go back and test, neither is the EPA, but I'm quite confident if we did go back and test, we would discover that the levels of pollution in sort of the main portions of the river have diminished remarkably. And that's the result of monitored natural recovery. So there is a concept there, and the EPA, I think, has tried to figure out where that's appropriate and where it's not, because there are also hotspots in the river where there is substantial dangerous pollution. There was a time here in Portland when we, a company here, manufactured dioxin before people really knew exactly what it was. The gas company used to make natural gas from coal, which is not a very pleasant process, and a lot of that ended up in the river. The United States of America prepared itself for the war effort right here at Swan Island, and unfortunately when they turned that property over to the port, they didn't take everything with them. So we're stuck dealing with that. But these are areas that need obvious attention. There will be a lot of dredging in areas where these heavy concentrations exist. Then the question is, what about the main stem, for example, where, as a matter of fact, we've been dredging for the last 125 years, as you've heard earlier, and not surprising, there isn't a huge concentration in the navigation channel. The other thing that I think is it's a particular challenge for the city because they own so many of the outfalls that go into the river. Some of the just the stuff that's in the river that's difficult to identify from any particular source, PCBs, which is one of the largest contaminants. Those of us who have been identified, that would be the port, the city, the gas company, and 134 others, will share the expense of cleaning up those portions of this material for which individuals cannot be found any longer, and that's a challenge. As for how the port pays for it, well, here's one thing everybody should know. The airport won't pay for a penny of it, and that's as a result of federal law, which has existed for some time, which essentially says this is the principle. If you make money at the airport, it stays at the airport. Though I would love to, put another quarter on the parking meter for every car that arrives and resolve our problem that way, we don't get to do it. So we have our general fund, which is comprised of lease revenues from our maritime terminals, a little tiny property tax applied here in the metropolitan area, and land sales. That is the tool. Those are the resources that we have available. It's going to be a very big struggle for us, and probably not one that we can complete or accomplish without some new tools available. And we're in the process of interacting with the state, who also, by the way, has an immense liability here as well about how we might be able to do that. But it's a challenge, and I think it's important for people to realize this. It may be tempting to think that rich out-of-state insurance companies are going to cover the cost of cleaning up the Willamette River, but the principally responsible parties include the Port of Portland, the City of Portland, the gas company, which in this case, for all practical purposes, is a government. If you buy natural gas here, you're going to pay for this as well, and the state of Oregon. And so the people of this region are going to end up assuming the cost of this cleanup in large measure. And I'm not saying that's a reason not to proceed as we are. It is a reason to proceed. We need to, but this is a problem we all own.
I appreciate that frankness, and I think that a piece of the issue that was maybe a subtext of what you said that we didn't spell out explicitly is the fact that some of those environmental health and human health issues that stem from the pollution in the sediments unfortunately probably affect people at the lower end of the economic spectrum more than others. And I think that really frames up for us some of the other kinds of questions, or reflects the framing of the other kinds of questions we've been talking about, where economic prosperity on one hand depends on keeping things affordable for our business partners, and protecting vulnerable humans, on the other hand, depends on finding a way to maybe make some of those investments. And
yeah, and I think I would say, as you framed it, there's really no balance involved. Human health and safety is first, period, end of sentence, and nothing ought to get in the way of that. That's extremely important. There are people who feed themselves by fishing on indigenous populations of fish in the Willamette River. I suspect probably not many people in this room, but they're out there. And so that has formed the basis of a large part of the effort undertaken by the EPA. And I think I can speak for us, and I'm assuming many of the other volunteers who step forward. That would be the city, the port, the gas company, Gunderson, and a list of 12 or 13 altogether. We're not in favor of compromising human health and safety. How you get there are lots of different ways to do that, and that's really what the discussion is now.
yeah, that's great. Thank you. So we have time for one more question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. And Greg earlier mentioned that there are cards on the table. So if you have a question and you are not a City Club member, if you could go ahead and write that question on the card, and people will come around, raise your hand, and people will come around and pick those up, and then we'll invite City Club members to ask questions. But I have one last question for you, Bill, before then, which is really back to this notion of a changing economy. One of the things we have heard from some local economists is, while there is still an emphasis on moving large goods, and in our conversation preparing for this, we talked about the enormous volume of soybeans that we ship to China, for example. But in our sort of changing regional economy, we see more and more emphasis on smaller goods and services and knowledge exports. How do you see the port evolving with that changing economy?
Well, you know, this is a really interesting conversation, I think, for those of us who work in our world. And, you know, I think you're talking about Joe Courtwright, with whom I've had a lot of interaction over the years. In fact, I knew Joe when he was working for the legislature way back in the day. And he is a proponent of the so-called the knowledge economy, which is the folks I was talking about earlier, sitting around here coding and doing software development, and you know, just the myriad of things that go along with the digital age, I think I would say. And I don't argue with any of that. In fact, I would say one of the great things about the job that I have and about the work that we do at the port is we kind of get a front row seat to what's happening in the world. I travel a lot on behalf of the port, and I can tell you, I see this world changing rapidly, and it affects us in ways that you can't even imagine. We're almost out of parking at the airport, and those of you who travel out there very much probably experience it on a regular basis. And one of the conversations we're having is, so, all right, you push the button today, you build a garage, and it shows up in 5 or 6 years. What are cars going to look like? Are they going to park themselves in 20 years when we're done paying off the bonds for this facility? Is someone going to arrive and push a button and their car opens the garage door at home and drives out? Or maybe they don't have a car at all. Maybe they're just using a car sharing service, or, you know, on ad infinitum. The future is coming at us a lot faster than most of us are prepared to react to, and that certainly applies to us. Having said that, if the windows were open and we could look out, we'd see cranes, we'd see streetcars, we'd see, you know, concrete and asphalt and all of the things that go into great urban spaces that you have to have. Where's the glass coming from, the concrete, the ironwork, where are the people coming from who install all of that? So these things are going to continue, and we see ourselves engaged in both ends of that world. And just the fact that we are moving rapidly into the digital age doesn't mean that houses build themselves, or that office buildings just fall out of the sky. Infrastructure, the things that make this a special place require all of the stuff that we engage in other areas of the port. So I don't dispute, in fact, I embrace this digital world into which we're moving, but I would also say it doesn't mean that other areas of work, other areas of the economy aren't continuing as they have been over a long period of time. A third of our employees, not a third, but maybe 20% of our employees, they're licensed electricians. You know, that work isn't going away. We have one employee whose full-time job is lamping the airport, and when they're done at one end, time to start over at the other. And I'm just telling you, I think that that kind of work is going to continue. It's going to be very important, and yet at the same time, the nature of work is changing radically.
Thank you. We're talking with Bill Wyatt, Executive Director of the Port of Portland, at the City Club Friday Forum Luncheon. And we are going to turn now to member questions. I don't have any cards, so we're going to go straight to the first question.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. I think I knew you from about 30 years ago when we had someone running for governor. Anyway, realizing we're somewhere between the Flintstones and the Jetsons, and having fun with this, in the year 2100, what would it look like driving up to the different facilities that the port owns?
Wow. So Wakala, is that a Finnish name?
Yes, and I was born in Astoria.
See? All right. Wow, I think that's an interesting question. Think about this, though, in terms of airplanes. The 787, which Boeing now has in commercial service, is about 20 years in the making. And so as you think that far ahead, 2100 isn't as far away as you may think. My sense is in the world of commercial aviation, we will continue to have a very robust aviation sector, probably all biofuels of some sort or other. All of the airlines and the manufacturers are working in drop-in fuel standards so they can use something other than traditional carbon-based fuels. I'm sure there'll be less seat room, no warm meals.
Is that possible?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sure it's possible. They're working on that right now. But I'm not sure the experience of flying is going to be significantly different, but I'm not sure you're going to be driving to the airport by yourself. By that time, we'll have, you know, autonomous vehicles. The nature of the transportation, the surface transportation system, is going to change radically in that span of time. I'm not sure exactly what it's going to look like. If I did, I'd be there. But it is going to be very, very different. And so accessing the airport will be different. My guess is we may or may not have parking garages, right? Because who's going to want to store something that valuable if they're gone for a week or 2 weeks or whatever it is? Just push a button and have it show up and pick you up. I just think, you know, generally for the port, Not going to be that much different than for other aspects of society. There's going to be just a tremendous amount more automation. And I think when we talk about, the world of work, that's what I think about. Automation has its advantages, to be sure, but there are challenges with that because creating and maintaining the automation is a little different than doing the original work. And that's the big challenge of our time, in my opinion, is the changing nature of work is changing faster than the workforce itself. And I think that's where a lot more of the focus and energy is going to be.
Next question.
Thank you. Debbie Kay, City Club member and delighted owner of a piece of the carpet. Thank you so much. My question is about seismic readiness, Mr. Wyatt. Can you tell us, please, about the status of seismic readiness at the various port facilities and what we might expect after the possible likely Cascadia quake?
Well, I'll just start by describing the most likely scenario in the Cascadia subduction zone, because I think it's worth everybody getting this picture in your head. So the Loma Prieta earthquake down in San Francisco was, I think it was 7.1, something like that. It lasted for 37 seconds. Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, based on everything that we know today, 9.1, 9.2, and these are the scale is not a straight line. It goes up like this for 4.5 minutes. So the table sitting in front of you, moving back and forth probably as much as 3 feet. Not just the table, by the way, the whole building. And by the way, I think this is probably a space you don't want to be in. I'm just thinking right away. You don't want to be a lawyer in the Multnomah County Courthouse either. So the event is much more dramatic than anybody imagined 30 or 40 years ago. I'll talk about the airport. The core terminal building was built in 1958. There was no seismic code. There was no real understanding or appreciation for what earthquakes did or meant. And this is an issue that's in front of us right now. The airfield itself, in fact, the entire airport is built on liquefiable soils. It used to be, Columbia River bottom, and it's separated from the Columbia River by a dike that is also liquefiable, which is why we're going through this huge process now to certify all the dikes along the Columbia River. The airfield will be, I'll just be blunt here, it'll be unusable. The terminal building, our goal, our objective is to create a terminal building in which people inside the building at the time can survive. It'll be, if it's functional at all, it'll be barely functional. The airport isn't going to play a significant role in the recovery process afterwards. And if you listened, it was very timely. They just did the Cascadia Rising event, I think, which is a huge, huge exercise to look at recovery after the big one. And help is going to come really from across the mountains. It's going to come in probably helicopters, big helicopters. And it's going to take a long, long time. So those of you who are getting lectured about having your bug out bag and having a little water and some food, this is real. You should have that available wherever you live here in the metropolitan area. At the seaport, to be honest, it probably doesn't make a lot of difference because the bridges on the Columbia are going to be down. The channel will cave in. And that'll take a long, long time to repair. The Longview Bridge is old, and even though a lot of work has been done on it, the likelihood that it's going to survive an event of that sort is not great. The Astoria Bridge, I would say, is probably in worse shape than the Longview Bridge because of its proximity at the mouth of the Columbia River. And so the river itself is not going to be terribly useful from just a commercial perspective of getting stuff here in a hurry. It'll take some time. So anything on the waterfront that's built on liquefiable soils is going to be a challenge unless it's been fortified, and most of it's pretty old and hasn't been. So I'd love to paint a pretty picture for you, but it's not a pretty picture. And, it goes for large portions of downtown Portland, too, which are filled and going to be tough.
A sobering reminder for us to focus on preparation. Next question, please.
Hi, Carla Kelly, City Club member and former Port of Portland employee. Hi, Bill. I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the international air service. We've been getting some really exciting new flights. For a long time, it was very difficult for Portland to sell itself for nonstop international air, and it seems to be happening more and more. What are you doing, and what do you see in the future?
Yes, so I think I spoke to the City Club in my first speech here as Executive Director of the Port was in November of 2001. We call ourselves an international airport at that time by virtue of one daily departure between Portland and Vancouver, British Columbia. Those Canadians, they like to be reminded that they're a separate country. But it was made very clear to me by the Commission at the time and by a variety of local interests that having nonstop air service was going to be incredibly important to them as they thought about the development of our city and in the future. And so we began really a very aggressive marketing and business development strategy. And you will remember the very first one of those was Lufthansa, which flew from, in those days, Frankfurt to Portland and back again. And we employed a very unique method that we kind of still use to this day, and that is, the Nikes and the Intels and the others who were just pounding me over the head about the loss of the earlier Delta service to Asia. We said, okay, well, if you want it, you can have it, but you have to commit that you're going to use it. And we created, in the very first round, something called a travel bank. And these companies, to their everlasting credit, deposited money, in some cases a lot of money, which could only be withdrawn for the purchase of tickets on carriers, international carriers who came to Portland. We don't need to do that anymore because we've kind of proven ourselves, but Lufthansa suddenly found themselves with competition. Northwest Airlines began their service to Narita Airport in Tokyo, and then from Tokyo to points throughout Asia. Northwest was acquired by Delta Airlines in 2008, and Delta decided to operate service to Amsterdam. And so then all of a sudden we had two services to continental Europe, and then came the Great Recession. And Lufthansa finally, one of them was going to pull the plug because there just wasn't enough market there. Our market fell in half during that period. And so Delta continues to operate those two services, and I'm very happy to say they're very successful. But these international services, nonstop in particular, when you're going to a new destination, they have the effect of stimulating additional traffic. So we can tell you at the port exactly how many people got on an airplane today in Portland and ended up in Dublin, Ireland. However they got there, it doesn't make any difference. As long as they left from Portland. They might go to Chicago or Newark or wherever it is, but we know. What happens in the case of new service is you get all of that, plus you get maybe a 50% or in some cases 100% increase in traffic because people go, hey, it's there, I'm going to do it. And that stimulation effect has resulted now in Condor Airlines going to Frankfurt on a seasonal basis, Icelandair going to Reykjavik on a seasonal basis. Delta, I'm very happy to say, has just announced that they're going to be flying next season to London, which is our largest unserved international destination. Alaska, of course, does a variety of Mexico services. So they're all doing incredibly well. They're all expanding their both their networks, their frequencies, the number of times they're flying, and we have not seen any diminution in seat load factor, meaning every time they add a seat to the market, it gets filled. So I think more to come on that front. We're in the midst of recruiting an all-cargo freighter service to Asia. I think we're going to be successful with that. That'll be huge for the knowledge economy, people making these small things that need to get other places. So I'm very bullish about it.
We're out of broadcast time, and we'll have to stop for the day. If this program has inspired you to join City Club, you can do so at the registration table as you leave the room. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. Please join me in thanking Bill Wyatt and Catherine Ciarlo, as well as Ed Hershey of the Friday Forum Committee who produced today's program. We're adjourned.